Hello everyone, Loremaster of Sotek here, back with the next episode of the Ogre Kingdoms Q&A. We're not going to spend too much time building up to it. I am feeling a little meh today, so hopefully we're able to get this through without any issues, but in light of that, let's go ahead and just dive in. Our first question today comes from Harry Davies, and he asks, has there been any notable Chaos Ogres in the past, or even the end times, and which god do they favor the most? The most famous Chaos Ogre would ultimately probably be Tarmakon, who he's not technically a Chaos Ogre, he's more of a, well, he is literally this giant maggot monster that basically is able to, whenever somebody he burrows into the body and like controls it kind of like a puppet from the inside, but he's able to, whatever the body's abilities were in when they were like alive, he's able to literally manifest those powers on his own, in addition to his personal abilities, which he is a nasty guy. But Tarmakon, who is the Maggot Lord, his ultimate form, so to speak, during the Throne of Chaos storyline, which leads to Tarmakon's death, but he possessed many bodies, but his ultimate and final body was when he went on his big invasion to invade the Empire and try and claim the Throne of Chaos by destroying the city of Nuln. He fought, he came in really far to the east, because he actually came down from the Chaos Wastes into the Ogre Kingdoms, and like some of his army even battled Cathay, so he came in really far east, and he fought his way through the Ogre Kingdoms, so he battled this big old tribe that he defeated, but when he was fighting them, their tyrant, whose name was Karaka Break Mountain, he basically dueled Tarmakon in the body he had at the time and killed him, or killed the body. And Tarmakon, whenever somebody destroys or mortally wounds the body that he is controlling, he'll basically eat his way out of their chest and like leap at them, and then because he's a maggot, but he has like these horrifying giant teeth, like pinchers, and what his real gimmick is that if you kill the body he's in, he'll basically latch onto your throat and just eat his way into your body very quickly. And when I say a giant maggot, we're talking like a 3 to 4 foot creature, not like a little thing. But he possessed that body, and he became easily the strongest, I guess what you could technically call a Chaos Ogre that we've ever seen. But I can't think of any particularly famous individual Chaos Ogres. Chaos Ogres tend to be very much on the sideline of the actual Warriors of Chaos, and that ultimately that has to do with the way that they were implemented, because when Ogres were originally introduced into Warhammer Fantasy, at least like the modern age, they basically showed up in a bunch of different armies. So like you'd see Ogres in the Dogs of War, and then you'd see Ogres for the Empire and for Chaos and all this stuff. So they like had a lot of cameo appearances. And then in 6th edition, they got their own book, which was the Ogre Kingdoms book, and established, no, this race has like its own identity. And that's when Games Workshop really pulled away from the idea of mercenaries, and they started going purely with racial concepts. So you stopped, like after 6th edition, there were no more mercenary ogres. Like they existed in the lore, but if you played tabletop, you could not take ogres in your army unless you were playing with some kind of like fan rule set or something, or like a really particular campaign. But just because they kind of did away with the allies existed, so you could still, but it was usually like you had 2 players. It was like a 2v2, and the alliance system was between the players. It was not like you could not take an allied contingent in your army anymore, which you could prior to that. So that being said, As for who has the most ogres, the dark god who easily has the most ogres showing up as like individual typed units is Nurgle. Nurgle has a ton of chaos ogres, and they actually show up. I believe Forge World even released a unique set of chaos ogres, and it was for the Tarmacon series. But if I recall correctly, the Forge World had a set of specialized Nurgle chaos ogres, and and of course, you know, Tarmacon being the Maggot Lord, his biggest, nastiest form was as a Chaos Ogre, which was pretty awesome. Like, it's a very, very cool model if you ever want to look it up. That being said, all of the Dark Gods have Chaos Ogres. I would assume that the most popular in reality would probably be Khorne or Slaanesh, because they tend their lure, I guess, would appeal the most to ogres. You know, with Khorne, you have that battle lust and that endless satiation for violence and bloodshed, which ogres are really keen on. And then with Slaanesh is all about excess. You know, if you're a glutton, or you're super greedy, or you're super arrogant, like if there's something about you that is driven to the point of just complete over the top BS excessiveness, then you're probably going to end up with Slaanesh at some point, unless it's like so specialized that you end up with one of the other three. So I would very much expect that there were, from a lore perspective, you would probably have a good chance of running into Khorne Chaos Ogres or Slaanesh Chaos Ogres. Tzeentch probably has very, very, very few. The amount of connections between Tzeentch and Ogre culture, or at least for Chaos Ogres, is almost non-existent. So I imagine Tzeentchian Ogres, they definitely existed, but they were probably pretty rare. And of course, Nurgle Ogres show up a lot, but I think that has more to do with like the modeling. I don't think that's as much supported by the lore as it is supported by, it was just really easy for Chaos Ogres to look like they fit. Just because a lot of Nurgle's warriors tend to be really bloated, big, fat dudes, and ogres are kind of like already in that sphere. But hopefully that answers that. Fangs out. Are there, is the name of the person asking the question. Are there any races ogres are not willing to work with? Like, I imagine ogres will do mercenary work for just about anybody, but is there one race they just distrust or hate on principle enough that they won't even consider a job even if they're being paid and fed? And then the second question he has is, what do I think of an ogre mechanic being in Total War, such as a Regiment of Renown tab with ogres in it for some armies, but the catch is that they're very expensive and have a loyalty meter like Dark Elf or Skaven Lords. So, for the first part, Chaos Ogres are willing to work for anybody. There is nobody that they will not work for as long as there's enough pay. The only, as far as like all of the playable factions go, the only race, which we talked about at the end of last episode, that the ogres really hate on a fundamental level is the Dragon Ogres. The Dragon Ogres, there's nothing they could do to pull in ogres to work for them. However, they're not, you know, they're a very, very specific subspecies, and they would never hire out the ogres to begin with. So, but as far as like all of the 16 to 20, probably is what we're going to have by the end of 20 War playable factions or races, no, ogres would work with anybody, even the Skaven, Dark Elves, Greenskins, Tomb Kings, Vampire Counts. Like, they'll work for anybody as long as that person's willing to put up with them and is willing to pay them what they want. As to the second part, how would I feel about ogre mercenaries? So this is probably not a super popular, no, I know it's not a popular opinion, but I am not a big fan of allowing the different races in Total War to mix, and that's only because I'm very focused on the game as it existed in 7th and 8th edition, just because that's what I grew up with. You know, 6th edition existed when I started, like 6th edition had just started when I had started playing, but I was little. You know, I was only like 9, 10 years old when I started playing Warhammer Fantasy, so by the time that I was able to really grasp the game and could actually read all the lore and really understand it and could afford to get all the books I wanted and stuff, we were in 7th edition. So to me, the concept of allowing different races to mix together into an army tends to take away from the purified version, because you start basically losing the aesthetics of that faction, in my opinion. Which, this is just an opinion. I'm not saying that it should necessarily be enforced, but if you're asking my thoughts on it, I really don't like when a faction gets access to something that they're not supposed to, just because it tends to be a designed weakness of them. You know, like, I would never want dwarves to get cavalry of any kind. Like, I don't care if it's dwarves hiring ogres on Mournfangs. I don't care if it's Bretonnian mercenaries or like knights that have shown up and stuff like that. I hate that idea. But there are undoubtedly people that would love that because they just think it's really cool. To me, that takes away from the faction by adding to it and eliminating some of its gimmicks, you know? That being said, Ogres are kind of where I'm a little more lenient on the idea of that. I fully expect that when Ogre Kingdoms are added to the game and we get the Immortal Empire, or whatever the hell they're going to call like the massive world map for Game 3, I very, very much expect that there will probably be at least one Empire subfaction, or at least all the Empire subfactions, that will have the ability to hire Ogres as some kind of like super rare unit. That being said, I would desperately hope that it's a very small subset. Like, it should be like maybe a handful, like 2 units max. You know, not like total, but like you should be able to get maybe Iron Guts, or sorry, you should be able to get oh god, what are the basic ogres called? They're not Iron Guts. Iron Guts are like the slightly elite class, but whatever. The regular ogres and like man-eaters, because man-eaters tend to travel a lot. Those would be the only 2 options I would want to see available. I would never want to see Mournfangs or the big monsters or bruisers or tyrants or any of the wizards. Like, none of that should be, Noblards, none of those should be available to any of the other factions. You know, it should just be like a super basic bitch unit. Not the like really cool iconic units for the faction. And even then, I would very much like it if it was reliant on some kind of system where it came with significant barriers. Like, either the unit had a very expensive upkeep, or, you know, you had to fulfill some kind of set of circumstances to even get access to them in the first place. But I could totally see that happening. And like I said, just because you asked my opinion on it, I'm not a huge fan of that. I'm okay with it for the Empire, but that would really be it. Even though Ogres have canonically worked for just about everybody else, I really would not want to see factions like the Tomb Kings or Skaven or Elves or Bretonnia or even the Dwarves. I wouldn't want them getting access to Ogre units, because I feel like that starts to really mess with roster designs and how the like armies are supposed to function and stuff like that. Arthur Daphos. Which clans have the best relations or ties with the Chaos Dwarves, and did Cetra the Imperishable ever interact with the Ogre Kingdoms? So we talked about this excessively at the end of last episode, or near the end of last episode, of that the Chaos Dwarves have a very mutually beneficial relationship with the Ogre Kingdoms as a whole. The Ogres do not view them as like supervillains, and they are happy to work with them a lot of the time. That being said, I don't think many of them would consider the Chaos Dwarves allies, more of just beneficial trade partners. The only 2 tribes that are very well known for having a very close relationship, like they are full on, like if the Chaos Dwarves were to suddenly go out on a mass war, like they were going to march out and invade somebody, and they called all the influential allies they had to hand, the 2 tribes that they would call on are the 2 northwesternmost ogre tribes, which are the Ironskins, who we talked a lot about at the end of last episode, or during last episode, and the Slave Takers, which the Slave Taker tribe, you can imagine, is very good friends with the Chaos Dwarves, because that's the primary resource that the Chaos Dwarves are trying to get access to when they trade from people. So those are like their best buds. That being said, almost all of the Ogre tribes will trade at least somewhat with the Chaos Dwarves, but a lot of the tribes will fight the Chaos Dwarves too. As for Cetra, the Chaos Dwarves the Ogre Kingdoms had already been established by the time Cetra was born, so he 100% had fights against them, both in life and in undeath. The Ogres have always been trying to expand further west. Usually it's just like a small tribe or something that goes out to do massive raiding and stuff. And during the time of Cetra's life, his empire was hands down the big bosses in the entire continent of the Southlands. I mean, obviously the Lizardmen were pretty dominant in the southern jungles, but if you ever when you play on Total War, you'll notice there's a really big pass that connects the Lamia and all those guys to the Tomb Kings, which I believe, if I can recall correctly, is known as it's either the Valley of Kings or the Valley of Stone Guardians or something like that. But it's a super important place where a lot of really famous battles have happened between the Tomb Kings and the Ogres. And the Ogre Kingdoms and the Tomb Kings have actually fought tons of times over the last few thousand years. And Cetra undoubtedly battled a number of Ogre tribes while he was alive, and of course after he came back. Hugh Gedney, there's a name I recognize, because he always asks these kinds of questions. Love you, Hugh. Hope you're doing well. He likes to ask population-based questions. How many ogres are there in Warhammer Fantasy? So, I don't know. And that's virtually always going to be the answer when it comes to any of the Warhammer races, and it's just because Games Workshop never got into that detailed of world building when it came to Warhammer Fantasy. And it has to basically do with the fact that Games Workshop cared a lot less about the world and the lore than they did about just selling models and trying to get people to buy shit. Black Library back then, I do not think was nearly as strong or supported as it is now. And unfortunately, especially for Games Workshop, when you have so many people trying to essentially, when you have so many different authors, it takes a lot of work to basically A, have that many people and try and coordinate them, and B, even you would think it would be a lot simpler, and maybe it would be, but they were just too lazy to do it, if you're going to have authors work on a project where there's 20, 30 plus authors all writing different stories about the Warhammer Fantasy universe. You would think that Games Workshop would provide them with a bullet list of oh, you're going to talk about this subject? Okay, here is the canonical things that you need to know. But they didn't do that a lot of the time, which is why you can go back and read books and you can get some wildly different interpretations of events. You'll read an army book, and then you'll read the Black Library books about what happened in those army books, and totally different things are going down. And unfortunately, that was just a super lazy habit of Black Library and Games Workshop, was that they did not give a shit about enforcing having a canonical universe. It is all over the place. And that makes my job really frustrating sometimes, which is why whenever I'm trying to establish canon, I have to tell people that my version of canon might be different than yours, because I have a very particular rating system that I use to determine the authenticity of a claim or a fact stated in a book. That the army books are the most canonical source unless they disagree with one another, which happens sometimes. And if two army books disagree with each other, then I use whichever one is the most recent, or I use the one that is talking about itself. So, for instance, probably the most famous one I can talk about is that almost all of the army books are really well written and reference each other in really cool ways that support the canon universe, except for the Dark Elf 8th edition book. The Dark Elf 8th edition book is fucking garbage. I hate that book. Matt Ward wrote that book, and some of the books he wrote were really good. Like the Wood Elf 8th edition book was pretty good, but the Dark Elf book was garbage because it did not give a shit about any of the other army books lore that it decided to bring up, and it basically took like High Elf lore, Empire lore, Lizardman lore, and like it just took a bunch of stuff and just fucked it. Like it didn't give a shit. And so I cannot consider the Dark Elf 8th edition book canonical unless it is only talking about stuff that is not referenced anywhere else. That was a super big tangent to say how many ogres are there? Probably in the millions. I would say maybe tens of millions. There is not so many ogres that they would be able to just curb stomp everyone else on the planet. But there are enough ogres that if the ogre kingdoms, like in the end times, decided to actually mobilize as a giant legion, then it's basically an apocalyptic scenario for most other empires, just because there's not a great feasible way to stop them. Of course, unless all the greenskins unite and run into them, and then you kind of have two unstoppable forces colliding with each other. So I'd say from a global perspective, probably in the low 10 million, maybe 20 million. Not like an assload of them, but enough of them that if they suddenly started like actually beelining towards somebody, you'd be in trouble. Our next question comes from Nivopolis, and he's got 3 little questions here. Are there ogre pirate captains? 2, are there any races apart from snotlings that fight for ogres? And 3, what race apart from the snotlings have the best relationship with ogres? So the first part is, are there ogre captains? Yes, absolutely there are ogre pirate captains. And they're probably exceedingly rare, but they do exist. Ogres tend to be more like bodyguards or the muscle. They tend not to really value being in charge as much as they value being taken care of as far as food and money is concerned, and being a bully. As long as they get their needs met, then they don't really care about trying to advance. But there have been some particularly ambitious man-eaters who have become full-out pirate captains, and they would probably be the most terrifying individuals on the high seas of Warhammer Fantasy, and would probably have the biggest captain hat you can possibly imagine. Second part is, this happens a lot, but a lot of people get snotlings, goblins, and noblars mixed up. They're 3 distinct species of goblin. They're subspecies. So you have regular goblins, and then you have snotlings, which snotlings are like they're itty bitty, like they're the tiniest form of goblin, to the point that you can't even really call them goblins. They're like, if orcs and goblins are distinct species, then snotlings are their own distinct subspecies, because they are so different and have some really interesting traits. But they kind of look like goblins, but their head to body ratio, they have much larger heads, and they're also like so hilariously stupid that whether or not they can even talk changes from book to book. But they're sad little creatures. That being said, what the ogres have are noblars. Noblars are a species of goblin known as hill goblins, which is vaguely what noblar means. And they live in the lower Darklands near the Ogre Kingdoms. They had an area of their own that was known as Noblar Country. And the problem with it is that noblars are the weakest form of goblin. So if you had like a tier system of goblins, you'd probably go hobgoblins are like the physically strongest and largest. Then you'd go probably to common goblins, or like the ones you would see like on wolf riders out in the Darklands and the Badlands. So like the most common type of goblin, which you'll find above ground. Then you would probably have your forest goblins. Then you'd probably have your night goblins. Though night goblins are more dangerous than forest goblins, but for like physical strength, I would put forest goblins a little higher. And then beneath the night goblins, you would have noblars. And the problem with noblars is they are not nearly as numerous as other goblins. They're one of the more rare species because they only exist in the Mountains of Morn and Noblar Country. And they are also the smallest. So it was really easy for them to get picked on and bullied by other greenskins. So that's why they teamed up with the Ogres. But is there anyone else that has that kind of relationship with the Ogres? No. The Noblars and the Ogres have a symbiotic relationship, and it's exclusive to them. There's no one else in that relationship outside of like monsters and beasts and stuff. And then who has the best relationship with the Ogre Kingdoms outside of the Noblars would probably be the Chaos Dwarfs. The Chaos Dwarfs have a very, very good trade relationship with them. Oh, we got another question here from Fangs Out. How large do Ogre armies tend to be, not including Noblars? I know it's not quite on par with the lore, but if we're going to go by Total War standards, where we have 16 to a unit at 20 units, and he means 16 guys to a unit like you would see with like Minotaurs and other similar Ogre-sized guys. If you had 20 of those units to a 20 stack, the absolute largest army of Ogres you could possibly get would be around 320 models, and that seems very small even when compared to races like Elves. So this is a little weird to answer because I cannot say, because I don't know, how exactly Creative Assembly is going to handle the Ogre problem. Because that is a distinct issue they're going to have to deal with going into Warhammer 3, is that Ogres are a very unique race in Warhammer Fantasy because they're 90% big dudes. And in tabletop, there was no such thing as anti-large or... and if you were tough enough, then shooting attacks would just bounce off of you. So Ogres had a lot of defenses that, or things they just didn't have to worry about in tabletop that are distinct threats in Total War Warhammer. Because in Total War, they brought over Total War concepts like anti-large, and then they also have a problem that probably needs to be addressed with the game, though I don't know if there's any way that could be addressed without fundamentally breaking it, which is that because the way the video game is designed, shooting attacks are guaranteed to do damage as long as they hit. And the problem with Total War is that even the most inaccurate units in the game, like goblins that literally have like a thing on their card that says poor accuracy, they're basically laser guided. Like, they're very accurate. And even if you have 1 billion armor and 1 billion health, and you have like missile resistance, and you have a silver or gold shield, you're still guaranteed to take damage. Which for Ogres is a big problem, because when you don't have a lot of unit models in a unit, and your opponent has like a shitload of archers, even if they're absolute crap tier, because they're guaranteed to do damage, Ogres, from a lot of people are worried, are going to just get eviscerated by lower tier infantry, you know, like spearmen, halberds, and then like guns and archers, just because they're big. So they're going to be vulnerable to lots of shooting even when they're in combat, and of course they're going to be vulnerable to anti-large. And I can't tell you how they're going to fix that. I have some theories on ways that could be fixed, but I don't know. As for your particular question, when it comes to purely numbers, I honestly don't think that's going to be as big of an issue. However, I would correct your estimates a little bit. When I, as a tabletop player, when I look at the average tabletop unit size compared to the way Total War adjusts for it, what Total War tends to do, because Total War obviously has much larger units than we had in Warhammer Fantasy, because Warhammer Fantasy, although was already super expensive, and if you were trying to play with Total War sized armies, you literally have to be spending like tens of thousands of dollars to be able to afford it. So, but what Total War tends to do is they, at least in my opinion, is they tend to take the unit at its traditional tabletop size and multiply it by like, traditionally they'll usually take a unit of like a unit and multiply it to its maximum size that you would ever see on tabletop. So we had a system in tabletop called Horde units, and depending on the unit's classification, it would change how many models you needed to run them in Horde size. So, you know, like Skaven Slaves, yeah, you'd totally expect, if you were like looking at like a max tier unit, yeah, you'd be looking at like 90 to 120 of them. You know, Saurus, you'd be looking at 40 to 60 of them. So on and so forth. Ogres, I don't think would get as small as 16 to a unit. I think ogres are more realistically going to be at roughly 24 to a unit, because that would put them at like their maximum horde size. Because to get a horde size unit of ogres, they had to be 6 wide, and traditionally you would want at least 4 ranks in a unit. So if you were to see like a horde ogre unit, you'd probably see 6 by 4, which would end you up at 24 models. So I'm honestly expecting there to be somewhere between 24 to 30 guys in a unit when they hit Total War, unless they decide to drastically change how ogres function. That being said, they're probably going to be an exceptionally small army. You know, I would not be super surprised if ogres come out and you're looking at less than 50 guys in every, less than 40 guys in every unit, unless they're Noblars, and Noblars will probably be Skaven sized, where it's 60 to 120 models, and then you'll just have huge monsters, like the Stonehorns and stuff. It's going to be tricky to see how they're going to try and interpret that and fix it. And the only way I think they're going to be able to pull that off is that they're going to have to fundamentally go back and readdress how large units are handled. And ogres are probably going to have to hit really hard and be reliable at it. One of my 10 issues a little bit with monstrous infantry in this game tends to be that their likelihood to actually connect when they swing is kind of low, which seems a little unfair to me based on how ranged weapons work. But I don't know. We'll have to see how they choose to handle it. Personally, I'm really hoping that they introduce a system that allows certain units to lower enemy anti-large rates. Like, it'd be great if ogres, their gut plates had the ability of, if ogre gut plates reduce enemy anti-large by 10 or whatever. That I would really appreciate that system of being able to mitigate anti-large and anti-infantry bonuses. I've always found it silly that those are completely unmodifiable, unless they're going up. Like, there are a fair amount of abilities that exist in the game now that actually give anti-large nearby or anti-infantry nearby, and I really feel like they should add in the ability to lower those. But that's like a whole can of worms I'm not going to open right now about some issues that I have with the way Total War has interpreted different systems of the game. So, yeah. Our last question today comes from Harrison Anton, and he asks, do I see a mercenary system outside of Regiments of Renown being added to Game 3, possibly on the back of the Ogre Kingdoms? Thanks and love your channel. Well, first of all, thanks for the nice words. Second of all, I honestly am really going to be surprised if we do not see a full-on Dogs of War mechanic. I don't think the Dogs of War would ever be like a unique faction, but I could totally see a Dogs of War DLC that literally just adds in a mercenary system to the game. Like, that would literally just be the point of the DLC. Would be, boom, here are mercenaries, and almost all of them would just be famous Dog of War units. That being, that seems inevitable to me. The only reason I could see them not doing that is, the only way I would see them not doing it would be if Games Workshop came to them and was like, we do not want the Dogs of War, don't reference them, do not put them in the game, period. That's the only way I could see that not happening. Because to me, that seems like a easy slam dunk for them, would be releasing, like a $20 DLC or whatever, that gives you like the Giants of Albion and the Dragon Lord and the like just all of the goofy ancient, famous Dogs of War units, and they would just be, maybe it would just be something similar to the Regiment of Renown system, where you can purchase them at different, once your characters reach enough levels or you accomplish some kind of quest or whatever. And, if they wanted to really work on it, then they could go back all the way to the actual Dogs of War book, where it's like, oh yeah, so if you play Lizardmen, you can only recruit these Dog of War units. But if you play Empire, then you can get these ones and stuff like that, so that there'd be a different selection and stuff. But to me, that seems vaguely inevitable, unless Games Workshop kills it, which could happen. I mean, Games Workshop went very out of their way to just like crush and grind the Dogs of War out of Warhammer Fantasy. to the point that they just don't exist in 8th edition. You know, virtually all of them were completely wiped out, and every reference to them was like purged from the lore. And it has to do with the fact that a lot of them don't make sense in the modern canon, and most of them were completely comedy groups, for lack of a better term. Like they were very goofy and so over the top that it was comical. Just because they just didn't, you know, like Long Drawn Slayer pirates, and there's another, I forget what they're called, but there was one that was like undead from every race, because I think it's like if they killed anybody, that person would join them as a skeleton. Like that one was super weird. You have Tichi Huichi's Raiders, which are my favorite Dogs of War unit, which I would love to see as a regiment of renown for Lizardmen. But they were skinks that rode on horned ones, but their lore was super goofy, because it was all about like the Slaawn Lord of Zlatlan would use telepathy across the planet to convince people to hire them, and that's how they justified Lizardmen working for people, even though a lot of people like didn't think Lizardmen existed and all sorts of crap like that. So I don't know, but hopefully that answers that. The mercenary conversation is going to be very interesting once we're in Game 3. I am not expecting mercenaries to be a system at release for Total War 3, Warhammer 3, but I could definitely see it being a DLC. But who knows? In any event, thank you all for watching. Hope you're having a nice week. Man, I'll tell y'all what, I need to like get out and get some sunlight and exercise stuff. I'm just starting to feel bad. But I think it's just because I've been cooped up and my sleep schedule is like reversed right now. So I'm awake at night and I'm sleeping during the day. And I think that tends to make me feel really bad. So, I don't know. Any event, thank you all so much for watching. Please take care of yourselves. Stay safe. And if you live in Texas, do not go out on May the 1st. I know the governor's reopening the state and he's a fucking moron. Just stay inside. Please stay safe. Do not put yourself at risk for stupid shit. I beg you. In any event, have a great day, guys. And